Hello, are we ready? Shall I make a start? Great, that's wonderful. Welcome all to this webinar on Is Development a Racist Discipline? I'm Shireen Rai, and I'm the director of Warwick Interdisciplinary Research Center for International Development, or WICID as we like to call it, and I will be chairing today's webinar. This webinar is being co-organized by WICID and SOAS, Department of Politics, and thanks to Meera Sabaratnam for all the help she has given in bringing this together with me. WICID, I'd like to just introduce it because most of you would know SOAS, Department of Politics, is a young center, barely 2.5 years old, and it's committed to developing critical approaches to the study of international development as discipline and as practice. Interdisciplinary and robust analyses through collaborative knowledge building and exchange characterize WICID's approach and ensure impact in the 4 areas of work that broad areas that we work in: gender, mobilities, peace, conflict and justice, and health. We also have a methods lab where we have resources that are open access for all of our colleagues and beyond, which focus on developing rigorous, innovative, and interdisciplinary methodologies to pursue our collaborative research and impact work. Please subscribe to our newsletter so that we can keep you up to date with the latest news, events, and opportunities. As part of our series, seminar series on inequalities, we hope that this panel will contribute to the ongoing interrogation of the racialized nature of international development, both as an academic discipline and practice, and how we might challenge and reshape it. While the title of this webinar might seem a bit provocative, and it was meant to be, it is, I would suggest, pertinent as well as urgent. Long histories of colonialism have underpinned international development as a field. The exclusions of concerns of the oppressed, the reproduction of tropes of civilizational superiority, and the epistemic and political violence of modernity have all combined to consolidate privilege within the discipline and practice of international development. In terms of practice, for example, Bond have recently reported that only 3% of charity executives are people of color, 54% have experienced racial discrimination at work, and Black workers with degrees earn on average 23.1% less than their white colleagues. However, this privilege has also been challenged through liberation struggles, in voices of the marginalized through both excavation of different histories and archives of thought, and extending different practices of development, collective and vernacular. This is not to overlook the politics of complicity of the states enmeshed in the unequal relationships or relationship of global capitalism, of course. Rather, ranging diversely in terms of approaches, geographies, and disciplines, we hope this intervention will help us understand the histories of oppression that underpin exclusions, discursive spaces that are colonized to reproduce them, and the struggles that challenge and reshape international development and practice. We have a stunning cast of participants today. Each speaker will speak for 15 minutes before we open up to your questions and comments. So let me introduce you to them. Our speakers are in the order of appearance. Jenna Marshall from the University of Kassel is a senior researcher for development policy and post-colonial studies. Her research interests take a critical approach to international relations with a particular interest to empire and the reproduction of colonial global order in contemporary discourses on global governance. More broadly, she's interested in global historical sociological inquiry, the politics of post-colonial and development world, the political economy of development, and post-decolonial critiques of Eurocentric discourse and methodology. Today, she will explore how development theory is, in both its conventional and critical traditions, works to construct an African subjectivity that is imbued with pathologized Blackness, which hinders the possibility of self-determination. After Jenna, Olivia Rutazibwa, University of Portsmouth. Olivia is a Belgian-Rwandan IR scholar and a senior lecturer in European and International Development Studies. She's also the Senior Research Fellow of the Johannesburg Institute of Advanced Studies. In September 2021, she joins the Department of Sociology at the London School of Economics and Political Science as Assistant Professor in Human Rights and Politics. Her research and teaching focuses on ways to decolonize international solidarity. Olivia is the co-editor of the Routledge Handbook of Postcolonial Politics with Robbie Shilliam in 2018, and Decolonization and Feminisms in Global Teaching and Learning with Sarah De Jong and Rosalba Egaza, also 2018. She will speak to colonial continuities of the aid industry and discourse, racism as technology of life and death and hierarchy. What does anti-racist, anti-colonial solidarity need us to attend to? Siba, our third speaker is Siba Grovogui, who is a professor of international relations theory and law at Cornell University. He is currently completing 2 manuscripts, lucky person. First is Otherwise Human and Humanitarian Rights Traditions, which aims to bypass the instrumentalization of human rights discourses in favor of an inquiry into genealogies of conceptions of human and protected faculties beyond the West. And the second book is titled Future Anterior, A Genealogy of International Relations and Society, which examines the past of international relations with particular regard to identities, values, and roles of multiple agents, subjects, and actors in bringing about international society. Our final speaker will be Meera Sabaratnam from SOAS, University of London. She is senior lecturer in international relations in the Department of Politics. She researches the colonial and post-colonial contours of world politics at the levels of both theory and practice. Her recently published work looks at how racialized subject positioning informs international relations theory, and her award-winning award-winning book, Decolonizing Intervention, examines international aid from the perspectives of its targets. She's on the editorial boards of International Studies Quarterly and Security Dialogue, and is a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy in the UK. And today, Meera will reflect on the question, how do we account for the fact that progressive thinkers, including critics of empire and racism, Du Bois, Walter Rodney, Jawaharlal Nehru, and others, have also used the frameworks of development and underdevelopment within their thinking? So you can, I hope you will agree with me that this is going to be an amazing conversation. But before I I give the floor over to Jenna, the usual housekeeping. Please keep your, I think you'll be all muted automatically, but please put any questions to the speakers in the Q&A box, and I will keep an eye for those for our discussion at the end. We will also be live tweeting the webinar through our handle @WICID. Please follow us to engage with this and other aspects of our work. And finally, on GDPR, we will be recording this seminar. Please read through the GDPR statement in the chat and let me know if you have, or let Shreyanshi know if you have any issues with recording this. So we'll make sure, of course, that we'll take appropriate action. So without much ado now, let me give the floor to Jenna. Thank you.
Thank you, Shireen. Thank you, Meera, for organizing today's event and for the invitation. So I would like to respond to the provocation, is development a racist discipline, through situating the theorizing of the development problematic as one which disavows post-colonial citizenship. And hopefully I'll be able to sketch out what I mean by that in the next 15 minutes. So first, I just want to speak about how Africa particularly holds a peculiar place in the Western imagination. We have the colonial historiographies that have this particular characterization of the African as backward and primitive and exotic. Modern depictions have yet to fully depart from a similar essentialist logic within the field of development studies that yields a nuanced yet equally problematic visualization of the African. And in her groundbreaking work, Race, Racism, and Development, Kalpana Wilson exposes how visual representations of poverty in Africa are not only gendered, but racialized, and that such imagery obscures relations of oppression and exploitation, which works to render collective challenges to neoliberal development models invisible. And such critical interventions by Wilson and also by Uma Kathari in development studies tend to maintain the role of colonialism and its neoliberal afterlives as organizing principles of extractivist ecologies that continue the exploitation of African lands, labor, and resources. And despite much of this work, development study research agendas remained in a form of technically improving governance. To quote Schilliam, that is, it claims to be a practice of technical exercise for marshaling scarce resources in the expectation of future benefits, right? For enhancing social and economic welfare, but particularly of the global South. So key to this form of governance are international institutions like the World Bank, and particularly through their public relations literature, they remained steadfast in their ontological groundings of what Africa is, i.e. a problematized economic arena. It is also clear in its use of an objectivist epistemology, that is, what suitable knowledge can be on the Africa problem, as well as a positivist methodology, one which suggests that generalizable solutions can be generated through a Eurocentric scientific model. So one such data that is generated into the useful knowledge of the problem and its application through the use of experts are deployed to enact this scientific knowledge into projects to bring the content and its people into modernity. So despite the rhetoric of income generation and poverty reduction programs, the development industry, inclusive of the World Bank and NGOs, have been more so implicated in the sustained reproduction of global socioeconomic inequalities than it has been in the process of dismantling them. So it is at this point I hope to make an intervention. The theorizing of the development problematic is broadly concerned with the question, who can or is fit to govern? And this question finds historical grounding in much of the 15th century twin seizures of indigenous lands and African labor, which meant to legitimate a claim of white Europeans over such marshaling of resources and people, as a form of manifest destiny over the darker races. Yet it is not sufficient to claim race as excluded in the theoretical constructions of the questions of governance, but rather how development theory inherently possess a racialized logic that is naturalized. So for the next 10 minutes, the purpose of this paper is twofold. One, I hope to contribute to a project of visibilizing the racialized hierarchies espoused in the work of Wilson and Kathari and others, to critically underscore the limitations of employing the most influential theories of development, namely developmentalism or modernization theory, dependency theory, and post-development theory. In doing so, I also seek to advance a repoliticizing of development theory through a return to the co-constitutive relationship between what I call a pathologized Blackness and citizenship, or what I should say is post-colonial citizenship. So my intervention holds that within development theory, how a pathologized Blackness is affixed to the African in a way that renders him unable to govern both its people and resources. As a consequence, it simultaneously produces as it disavows, at once conscripting the African subject into a theorizing of capitalist modernity and its attendant intellectual archive, while attuning such subjects to a narrow liberal paternalist notion of citizenship. So the purchase of such an argument is perhaps most immediately for, at least for my work, for global governance debates, with the rise of non-Western post-colonial states, of those on the continent and in their quest for economic policy coordination. So I just want to briefly sketch out, I'm just really mindful of time. Shireen is very fixed on time, but I just want to sketch out now a focus on development theory and its conscripts and what I mean by that. So bringing the African into modernity warranted theoretical considerations and policy prescriptions that hinged on the notion of betterment. The emergent paradigm of development shifted from pre-war ideologies of direct trusteeship or white direct trusteeship towards the potentiality of the African as a conscript into Western modernity as an agent of enlightenment. What is important to underscore here is that the African, through the process of conscription, remained tethered to, and I quote, a historical representations of geopolitical differentiations, which began with Hegel and subsequently elaborated by Marx, end quote. So while the planting of whiteness, and I borrow that phrase from the work of Tilly in her 2020 article, ensured the guardianship of technological prowess and reinforced the notion of white European legitimacy to command the frontier zones of the New World and elsewhere, the representation of the African, indicative of a pathologized Blackness, were affixed to the continent and its people. Most notably, and we see this in the work of the writings of post-colonial scholars like Mudimbe in his monograph, The Idea of Africa, but also in Fanon's work, Wretched of the Earth. And I believe here that the work of Fanon is pertinent to demonstrate how Blackness as a form of pathology forecloses the possibility of self-awareness, but also self-improvement. So wherein he outlines the extent to which the African as possessing Blackness is resultantly banished from the realm of human and suspended within the zone of non-being. So the universal desirability of development and the African's role in its advancement marked a change in course away from an overtly racist ideology with the representation of the irredeemable African to one characterized as a pathway to light and provenance. So I have argued, so let me just check the time, 9 minutes. I argue that development theory has not grappled sufficiently with this racialized politics of betterment, nor does it actively work to displace this inherent pathologized Blackness of the African, both in its conservative and critical forms, in its theorizing and critique of poverty and underdevelopment. And this can be witnessed in the manifold ways in which the dominant theories of development produce the African subject. And the focus of the paper that I will be taking forward here, first is the idea, at least from developmentalism and modernization theory, is the idea of the deficient subject. The African is deficient subject, followed by the absent subject, that is produced through dependency theory, and finally, the romanticized subject of post-development. And again, these are not new critiques, but essentially, it brings into sharp relief how the paradigm of development continues to render intelligible the continent and non-Western people through a narrow Western intellectual archive, and how pursuant to claims of an emancipatory project of development, to think through how this theorizing takes place. I think I will end here for now.
I'm not that strict. You've got like 3 minutes to go.
I have 3 minutes to go. I have about 5 more pages, but I think it's probably best to end here and to think about, I guess I can just summarize here then with my 3 minutes. So while development theory, from its nascent developmentalism and modernization theory to the more critical schools of thought, seek to provide critiques of Eurocentrism, nevertheless, more often than not, they continue to objectify the African as, quote, silent and trapped beyond escape within a grammar of a sovereign Western power. As a paradigm which, end quote, as a paradigm which seeks to disassociate from its previously overtly racist ideology, which affixes African competencies to a racialized hierarchy in the form of knowability, remains in place. So situating the African into Euro-fetishized molds maintain a pathologized Blackness, and the result is the foreclosure of the possibility of viewing Africa outside of the realm of problem. Development theory, in this sense, renders worlds, problems, and actors of Africa unknowable to Africans themselves on their own terms. This is because development theory, both in its conservative and critical forms, tend to assume that the only way to know Africa and its people is through a Western intellectual archive. So in this process, it reproduces a Western conceit of an enclosed Europe as global and exclusive supplier of theory, whereby the African remains the raw data to be rendered intelligible. So I will end there.
Thank you so much, Jenna. That is wonderful. Olivia.
Thank you very much. It's always a huge challenge to come after Jenna as well, actually. I really, really enjoyed these comments. Mine, I'm gonna try to maybe paint a lot of broad brushes. So I guess I want to formulate my comments as an invitation for people in the Q&A to bring more details and probably also more relief to what I will say. But the reason why I'm gonna do broad brushes is that it's not that I will say goodbye to development studies for the rest of my life, but I've been really at this moment where I'm thinking, yeah, you can build a whole career in, just keep on shouting how bad it is, we should get rid of it, whatever. But then at some point to have a particular moral clarity, I guess, in what we're doing, there's new questions that come up, right? In terms of, okay, once we've clearly said what's wrong with it, what's the reconstructive move? I'm not promising the reconstructive move here, but I really want to engage with this question of, is development a racist discipline? Because I've been thinking about it, and as Shirin said, it's clearly a provocation, but I want to engage maybe to start first with both the salience and the necessity of this question, and on the other hand, also very much the danger of this question as it's formulated as such. And I want to start with the danger because I think that should be the shortest answer of it, but I always say that and we'll see how short it's gonna be. But the danger on the one hand, obviously, is that whenever, and again, we're speaking in a particular context, let me make it concrete of, I wanted to say of Europe now, but we're in the UK, so apparently something else. But let's say in something Western place in which we're engaging with this, and I think it's important to highlight that. But the conversations we're having about race and racism there is a lot of it that is mostly distraction, right? So there is an actual danger to be trapped into to its backlash, so that, you know, the reaction to is vitriolic and distracts us from other stuff. But also a distraction that is maybe more middle of the road, where we could say we can literally spend, again, a whole career in trying to fine tune what racism is exactly, and having discussion, the extent, the variations, or so that the conversation becomes about fighting ground of what it is actually that this racism is. And I put this as a danger, not because I don't think that there is analytical salience in doing that work, but on the one hand, that work has been done maybe in the last 400 years. Like there's very little, you know, that maybe warrants much of our time, but also because this is very much the thing that takes up space, even in public opinion, when we invoke racism, right? Governments still feel like they can write reports to show us that there is no institutional racism or this or that. So I want to formulate that as a danger that is slightly different from the pure backlash one with the whole critical race theory thing. That's a slightly different nature, but it's a seemingly neutral analytical or intellectual one that still, I think, warrants our caution. The third danger, I think, is the one that we're living in, particularly in progressive circles today. It's this seeming enamoredness with the attention that is given to racism now and to decolonizing into any of these things. And again, there the danger is one of commodification and cooptation. And I think that one as well is a quite important one. So the reason why I said like this can be quite quick, and I already spoke like 3 minutes about it, so this is not that quick, but I think it's just much more productive to think about what's the salience and the necessity of still having this question on the table. And I think the one thing that I often bring up when we speak about racism is that it provides us with a shared language of moral clarity, because most often people are so virulent about this question because the majority of people will not come out and say, the one thing I want to be is racist, right? So the moral clarity that is part of this question, I think that is very much worth retaining. Again, that one should not take that much space. I think the other one aspect of it is, I think, engaging with racism as something that obviously goes way beyond individual good or bad character or behavior, or, you know, all the different ways in which it's misconstrued in individualist neoliberal understandings of it, is that engaging racism as a technology of life and death through hierarchy that decides or that informs or enacts, I think, premature death in many different ways. It allows us to recast the question of development in its actual historical and contemporary context, in stuff that happened, and not just as an abstract science of technical advancement that can just be, you know, reproduced or thought about in the abstract. So for me, that's very much the salience of engaging with the question of racism, is that it forces us to have a structural outlook, but also a very historicized outlook or understanding of the world or sense making that then is explicit about attending to who gets to live and who dies. So that's why I think that, as Shirin said in when she was introducing me, that the question of is development a racist discipline could be more constructively reformulated into what does anti-racist, and I would add anti-colonial solidarity, need to attend to. And I actually think it's not the same question, but that's, for me, it's like how we can distill a particular clear purpose of asking that question, the same provocative question, let's say, right? Which maybe would allow us throughout, and also if in the future we engage with this question, to anticipate the distraction that might be contained in its provocative formulation, but to try and think like, what is it then that we need to do? If we all decide we're not racist, we don't want to be racist, the question could actually be reformulated in sense of what do we need to attend to? And here I will just offer like I guess, I don't know. It's not even big words, but very few words that I think that can be filled out in various ways, depending on where somebody's speaking from. And I think that is quite important. And that maybe goes often against our disciplinary thinking, because we often try to look for shared ways of knowing, or maybe coming up with theories that are somehow, generalizable or applicable. I would very much advise against that in this conversation, but we'll come back to it. So what does anti-racist, anti-colonial solidarity need to attend to? Maybe I said it need to attend to rather than what would it look like, because again, trying to define it generally might be challenging or reproducing of certain hierarchies, I guess, in this. At the very first limit, and I wanted to say it's at its most minimal, but maybe it's at its most maximum, is that it's a recalibration of this whole question as development as something at the service of indiscriminate life in dignity. And I think, again, it stays quite vague, but yeah, take it as an invitation. And I think that it could be quite generative for us to think about what could that mean and how does that mean different things from different places, right? So it's obviously, reinscribing this idea that if racism is about life and death, but mostly the production of premature deaths of certain peoples, then anti-racist stance should be something at the service, and I would say development at the service of life. And, indiscriminate life in dignity, I think I added that, I've been thinking about these words because of the fact that in current practices and development and aid practices in particular, there is an unevenness in who is violated by that system, right? So the indiscriminate life is a thing. And then in dignity, I think it speaks a lot to what we understand from the pathology of Blackness or anti-Black racism and all the different ways in which that violence expresses itself, amongst other, in dehumanization, thingification of it. So dignity here very as a shortcut, trying to mitigate that. So that's the first general principle I think that I would want to throw out there as an invitation. The second one is something that I already briefly mentioned, but I do think that attending to this question needs us to try and be more comfortable with answering this in a situated and groundedness in both place and time as a relational question. And I still don't know exactly what that might mean at all times. I just know that what Western engagement with aid and development needs to do is at times, and quite often, I think, probably, but not always, quite different maybe than the development questions and how they are attended to in, let's say, the previously colonized places, but even within societies. So I don't really know where we draw the line and how we draw the line, but just as a principle to really push back against the idea that there's a general approach to development that could be there. And I think maybe more than geographically or even in terms of positionality, it's very much in terms of where historically we have been standing as peoples, right? And that brings me to the next one, where I think that development, especially from Western positionality, cannot engage with the concept of aid. There is nothing to be given if you have to give something back, right? Then we talk about repair. And so this is, I think, something that that could travel to different sides of this situated or the relational thing here, but specifically from a Northern perspective, I would say that we need to attend to both a material understanding and a cognitive understanding of what that repair should look like, right? So again, the material one, I think more and more people start to talk about it, and mostly to say how it's practically impossible. All of that, I think, warrants sufficient discussion, but it should be on the table, and not just on the table, it should be the center, I think, of engagement, even especially as a discipline or as a degree, I think I've said in other places as well, we offer a very different degree in international development aid if we attract students with the idea of having a degree in what do I need to study to be able to understand what global reparation looks like, right? And some of the topics might be similar, but you instill a very different power dynamic, but also very different historicizing of your of the materials that you offer your students. The cognitive reparation, or let's say attending to cognitive empire, very much speaks to the, and Jenna spoke to it as well, the very profound epistemicide that is at the heart of the development encounter, but also very much the whole civilizational thing is very much built on erasing the majority of knowledges and beings and practices in this planet, on this planet. So far, I think the majority, especially mainstream development, has been about reproducing that erasure rather than the re-excavation of people's knowing different ways of being in the world. So that, I think then, so apart from this indiscriminate life in dignity, the fact that we have to situate or ground it, and the idea of repair, whether it's material and cognitive, and I think both, I think the two last things that I would mention, and I think would be happy also to further develop in the Q&A, is then the logical follow-up of what I just said. I think especially, but no, I guess also generally, it might be an invitation to get more comfortable with the idea of both abolition and retreat. So it might be quite generous to think, what about development as a discipline that exists now? Do we need to get rid of? But also what practices within the development thinking. And for me, abolition or retreat is not a nihilistic move, nor is it destructive. It's literally making space to clear the imposition that has made development as we know it today as impoverished as it is, right? It's like, and I think to some extent that's very much the cancer of the colonial is the imposition and the eating up of all the space for the space for different choices, different ways of being, and all of that, right? But rather than thinking just in terms of what do we need to include, I think it might be really generative again to think of what do we literally need to get rid of and stop doing. And I think a last point that is useful for us to think about is, and I'm thinking specifically of, and I haven't read much of it yet, so, but because I use the word desires of Ilan Kapoor's latest work, trying to engage with yeah, what are the desires contained in international development on the one hand, but the desires for mastery specifically, and Julieta Singh speaks to that. I think that is a specifically important point of attention, because the insidiousness for me about development in particular, is that it comes to the table as a very benign, or as the most benign element of modernity, right? So I think it might be very useful for us to enter it as a place in which desires for mastery are reproduced while being covered up, but reproduced in a very profound way. So if we could think about the fact that anti-racist or anti-colonial solidarity needs to attend to radically alter this desire for mastery. Again, it's as an open door invitation to try and think through that. So I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. And lots and lots of questions already swirling in my head, and I'm sure they are already appearing in the Q&A. Siba, over to you.
Thank you. I actually just took the prompt itself as my charge, which is to think about development. And I'm not going to, I have no idea who my audience is, and therefore I'm not going to engage in too many superfluous acts. I just wanted to say a few things. I wanted to think about development as an idea and development as a project. The idea of development, as was remarked earlier, I suppose, in reference to Meera, that people, even people like Nehru, Nasser, Nkrumah, Sékou, and etc., use the idea of the language of development, because there's something about development that is in fact benign, which which we get to linguistically from different angles. The natural sciences and psychology, right? The idea that people evolve over time, that's the idea of evolution. There's also an idea of improvement, which has to do, again, even in my own mother tongue, you improve on your field, on your village by building bridges and etc. There is actually that sort of thing is sort of natural, no pun intended here, to fall into, to think about, stage A to stage B and etc. And so that actually in itself would not be, I don't know how racist it would be, and we can actually go to that, but that there's a kind of sort of benign plausibility to that to just say, we go from here to there. And I want to hang on to the idea of benign plausibility. But the other thing is obviously development as a project. What has sort of the insertion of that benign plausibility into historical project has allowed to happen, and what does it even permit today for us to do, which is for me the distinction between what is allowed colonial and what does it permit today colonizing, and those are two different gestures. And the way I talk about that actually is to just go concretely, because if I don't want to do the theories of those, I just want to go concretely. And I want to refer to three setups. I want to speak to the Lords who save, and in my case, I take that very seriously because saviors are always lords. There's always an overlordship implied in the idea of development, improving other people in particular. And as an African, in our context, I always start with a natural lord, Lord Lugard. Lord Lugard, who obviously the dual mandate, right, for whom development was a dual mandate. It was to open up Africa to the civilized world, meaning open door, having all Europeans have access to Africa, and at the same time open the African mind to civilization. Like, in the process of these people coming in, the African mind will be open to better ways of ruling themselves, governing, and etc. Right? So overlordships here is actually manifested through an actual lord, and I just like that. And obviously, again, in the African context, you can draw a straight line from Lord Lugard to the League of Nations Charter, and the proposition that there were people who, by reason of their resources, their experiences, and their geographical position, could undertake the responsibility of improving the life of others. Obviously, you can see that it clearly says people by reason of their resources, experiences, and their geographical location, which means that even the League of Nations was very clear that people who were developing were somewhere here on the north, again, a figure, and then people who were being developed would be below in the south. So, and I'm saying this because I actually want to come back to that. I hope we talk about that, about lords and the people they save. But in going back to the League of Nations Charter to Lord Lugard, I also want to just make a gesture to the power and the violence of knowing who they are. The problem with development, obviously, as a project here, is that these people who had the resources, the experiences, and the geographical position to help were, of course, people who also had the power of knowing who the people who needed development were, and in what proportion they needed development, right? And I go about the mandate system, which categorizes, again, these people who need help, the mandate A, mandate B, and mandate C. Those people who with little help could be improved, those people who can need their actual lordship, and those people who just need to be thrown in with the people who rule them, like you can just conquer them, occupy them, that's just who will resolve it. Otherwise, there was no other possibility. And so the power of knowing, the power and violence of knowing who they are is actually has been part of that development project, right? And it's not, so you have that. And so in this power of knowing, obviously, this power of knowing was always wrapped into certain idea of both altruism and solidarity. Again, in the League of Nations Charter, you have people who are not yet able to stand by themselves in the strenuous condition of the modern world. And it's not just the League of Nations, obviously, W.W. Rostow, the architect of development theory in America, also talks about different phases of development for traditional society, preparation, whatever. And obviously, in phase 3, America gets to decide who would support, whether they will be communist, liberal, and etc. All of those are complicated stories. The simpler one is obviously that we know who needs solidarity and in what proportion. So altruism and solidarity are not just benign. They also become a tool to remedy situations that we know are bad for those people, even if they themselves don't know that they are bad for them, but we do know. Right, and so that's also in this project. So the second problem for me in this project is not just that lords say, and that people proclaim themselves to be lords, as in Lord Lugar, or that people decide that they have the power to know who the people who need development and in what proportion. But there's also, in that process of knowing, development invented primitive. Again, you go to W.W. Rostow, and the 3 phases of civil development always start with traditional society. We decided that we know what tradition is, which good traditions are, and what good traditions are not. Right? Some traditions are good. We all know the racist tropes of the nimble Asian fingers and etc. during the 1980s and etc. in reference to women who were put in basically slave working situations in Southeast Asia and some parts of Asia. But then, even if we allow that all of these things are benign, which they are not, we also have to think about what instrument the Lord who knows and the manner in which he knows allows them to have, and that's the question of intervention. Intervention is also actually is the most dangerous part of development, obviously. Because intervention, actually, once you declare yourself as knowing, and you decide what you know and how you know, then of course, with knowledge and overlordship comes the idea of authority. What degree of control administration should be exercised? That has always been a constant actually in development, whether it was at the time of Lord Lugard or even in certain form of humanitarianism today, because it comes with certain kinds of authority, certain kinds of knowledge, mechanisms of control, and certain forms of administration that are actually not terribly devoid of what we are talking about here: race, geography, cartographies, and etc., etc. Some of which more explicit than others, right? So, and obviously, those forms of intervention, what they have done historically is actually create classes of people, not only those who can be developed, those who are beyond help, but also in the development project itself, certain classes, those people who make it, who are worthy of making it, those people who are not, and of course that distributes itself across the map today. And some of it is actually not terribly, the development project is not apologetic about that. We assume that it's assumed in development theory and praxis, obviously, that countries need capitalism being part of the project. And in that process, of course, there will be people who would make it. Certain classes are desirable. You need investment classes, you need industrial classes, you need these kind of classes. And so intervention actually comes with the creation of classes, some of whom are underclasses. And some of them are underclasses by design, as in actually in Africa, the most tragic case being people we call now the Bushmen, which is a classic underclass, people who were displaced from the land, stripped of their technology, and ended up wandering in the desert. And we make movies about them and laugh at them. But even in places like America, in Appalachia, miners, people who live mining communities and etc., who are basically seen as dispensable in some fashion, which is okay because even though they provide the most crucial labor energy, which supports the entire project of industrialization. And so you see that the whole development project depends on people who actually seem to be dispensable. It may seem like a paradox, but it is not, because that is actually also part of how development unfolds, right? So I wanted to actually say that because I don't know what my audience would have appetite for, but all I want to say is this, that I always look at development through the eyes of Diderot, obviously the father of the encyclopedia, for those people who know who Diderot is, who once said about the French upper class that there's nothing more, I'm sorry, I don't know why I have this thing in my throat. Hang on, please. Actually, sorry. That there's nothing more odious than having slaves and calling them citizens. And that is the problem, my problem with development, actually. I have no question at all about its appearance to be so benign. But sometimes we actually have to understand what we are doing to other people when we intervene, when we decide that we know them, and when we proclaim ourselves lords. And for me, that's the entire problem of development. And of course, to summarize just now, again, to go back to the League of Nations Charter, there has always been distribution there of authority, power, subject and classes of subject, and the violence that is permitted according to region, knowledge, resources, and power. And I want to stop there, and we'll talk about, we'll explore these ideas further. Thank you. I stop there. Merci.
Thank you, Siba. As always, sort of, really thought-provoking and within your time limit, which is amazing for me as a chair. That's great. Meera.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. So obviously going last, everybody has said a lot of what I wanted to say, and I will actually use that as an opportunity to very briefly recap, I think, the points on which I agree, and then maybe take it in a slightly different direction, and also to respond from a question we've had to the panelists that says that we're actually skirting the issue a little bit of whether development is a racist discipline or not. So I'll try and attend to that as well a bit more closely. So I think where we're all sitting is that, in a trivial sense, obviously development, the idea of development and the field of study that supports or is associated with it is racist in the sense that it has presumed a hierarchy of humans that is historically gradated through the ascription of different capabilities and entitlements to these different groups. And it organizes the world in such a way that both naturalizes it and reproduces it, right? So that is the kind of the underlying question. Is it a specifically racist discipline in the way that sociology or politics or economics or history are not? No, not necessarily, right? In that sense, this is the infrastructure of Enlightenment thought, as I think one of the Q&A things has already brought up. So in a way, the stakes of asking this question, I would agree with Olivia when we say that this is a good question to ask because it reminds us of particular kinds of structures, historical issues, power relations that are there, but we shouldn't stop at asking this question. So the things that I think we take for granted in terms of asking this question is, yes, of course, there are all these stereotypes, and we have Rostow and the racist origins of development discourse. And yes, this closely interlinks with, of course, what Ferguson famously called the anti-politics machine, right? The depoliticization of development as a sphere of human activity, then its ability to be led by experts who happen to be white and happen to be northern and happened to come from institutions associated with global capitalism. And then we have the work of people such as Uma Katari, Kalpana Wilson, others who have explicitly drawn together the ways in which race and racism are activated in contemporary development politics. So this is not just, if you like, that historic idea that of course came through Hegel and so on. But if we concretely look at how organizations work now, how programs work now, how projects work now, we see racialized hierarchies within them. And that was certainly something which my project on state building in Mozambique also threw up. The fact that it wasn't just the overarching discourse that was, if you like, hierarchical and racializing, but it was the day-to-day practice, right? The concrete manifestations of the aid machine that persistently prioritize the needs and presence and agency of the interveners over and above those who were their targets. So those, I think, are all kind of taken for granted when we look at this question. And then I'll come to the second bit then, which is about what we do about the fact that anti-colonial, anti-racist activists, scholars, thinkers talked in the language of development, and not just critically, right? They understood that there was a problem with how that hierarchy was working, but they wanted to reclaim or talk about something in there. So I'm going to use Walter Rodney maybe as an example of this. Rodney's famous book, of course, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which Olivia is telepathically holding up to the screen there. So we see that although Rodney is using the language of development, and on one level it's easy for, say, a Marxist reading to say, well, Rodney is just following classic Marxism too, and to a certain extent that is true. But Rodney, as he defines development at the outset, already has a twist on it, which takes it slightly away from, if you like, the capitalist articulation of development, and even slightly away from the Marxist articulation of development. So for Rodney, he says individual development is about increased skill and capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. So there's quite a complex, non-reductive kind of conception of individual freedom or well-being or progress kind of embedded there. And he says that societal development is the increasing capacity to regulate both internal and external relationships. And so, of course, the thesis is very much one that critiques, if you like, the internalist account of development, the idea that societies are the main generators and responsible for their own development, and talks about the external kind of interconnected conditions that have made modernity possible. Is that kind of enough? I mean, in a way, we know what the answer to some of these questions were. There were a number of socialist, developmentalist projects in the post-colonial world. And to some extent, they were successful, right? A number of them greatly uplifted the well-being of different people in different spaces. But they did not necessarily avoid the trap of becoming an anti-politics machine, right? So they did become quite hierarchical. They did become quite dispossessive. They became authoritarian in both formal and in informal senses. And in part, we can see beyond these models now, I think, through two forms of critique which are useful to bring to the table. The first is a feminist critique about, in a way, the fundamental nature of the economy, right? So by looking at feminist economics, which has centered reproductive economies rather than just sort of formal productive economies into the understanding of what the economy is. This actually radically reconfigures what it means to be productive, what it means for well-being to exist, how we think about reciprocity, how we think about relationality, and so on and so forth. The second is obviously something which is much more visible now, but of course is the sort of ecological critique of development and the idea of growth as being the primary indicator of development and industrialization as being the primary indicator of development. And so, of course, you have this degrowth movement as one of the manifestations of this rethinking of what well-being is really all about. And it's clear today that we are living in a global crisis of well-being, and that the idea of development has not necessarily provided an answer to all aspects of that, some aspects of it, yeah. So if we take, I think, the vibe that was coming from Olivia and Siba and Jenna, that there are possibilities for rethinking well-being and rethinking improvement that are beyond and outside the purview of the classic development machine, even its Marxist and its capitalist instantiations, if you like. can and should we use the discipline of development, or the, if you like, the aid machine to realize them? And here I'm skeptical that either of those instruments can be used to progress it. I mean, in a way, they have been responsible for being a home for some of this critique. So we can see people working in development studies who have produced these deep critiques. But in a way, that development studies has kind of been a safety valve for the pressure that is built up. So people come out of the field, they're going to the academy, they talk about all the problems with the field, but then that still becomes a self-contained conversation that is under the umbrella of development rather than the general umbrella of politics or democracy or, you know, or kind of global justice. So I would argue that what we really need to do is to go beyond development and beyond the aid machine, which is so dysfunctional, and I think everybody agrees on that, to think about how we generate mass popular movements for alternative structures, as well as the local conditions for people to realize their own improvement, right? So at the global level, the list is endless, but we can start with intellectual property rights, debt, currencies, trade rules, investment rules, the arms trade, you know, all of those infrastructural things, which mean that any piece of aid given is like a drop in the ocean that goes down the toilet, to mix my metaphors. All of that global infrastructural stuff should be stuff that I would say a lot of people can agree on. But that's the area where I think the movement needs to go. And I think there are some organizations working in the field of development that recognize this. For example, Oxfam has moved much more in this direction. And then at the local level, something like democracy as an alternative really to development politics. Democracy being understood as the ability to meaningfully control the conditions of one's well-being. And I think we accept this as what we need to do in the West, right? We don't talk about needing to develop poor areas in the UK, right? We talk about regeneration, we talk about community kind of building and so on. The idea that we should develop, you know, urban areas in the UK would be seen as very insulting and immediately problematic. And I think we need to see that problem around the world. So I will essentially stop here. I look forward to discussing with questions and so on. I know there'll be lots in the audience. Thanks.
Thanks, Meera. I think that was really wonderful conversation amongst the five of you who four of you, and who actually, I think, built on and layered each other's comments as well, which is amazing. And it actually just happened because our thinking is sort of traveling in certain ways, sort of, you know, to try and address the big question, which is not just whether, but also how do you move away from that? And some of the questions that are coming is they're actually reflecting people's interest in that as well. I also wanted to say that one thing that I have taken away from this is this kind of necessity, but also impossibility. Necessity of looking at the idea of development and as opposed to the project of development, as Siba put it, separately, but also the impossibility of doing so. And I think all of you have managed to kind of tell us why in one or another way. And building on that, I think, especially Olivia and Meera, your presentations made me think absolutely about not just solidarity, but solidarity with whom? Because it raises issues that Siba and Jenna have raised about class and about different groupings. It raises questions about the structures, that sort of not only the social infrastructure, but the infrastructure of capital within which we are functioning. So how do you kind of build solidarity based on race? Is it possible? Issues around sort of post-colonial states, etc., that Meera, you raised. But solidarity is also thinking ahead and thinking of where our allies are and who are our allies and how do you build alliances and solidarities across sort of, I suppose, lines and borders and boundaries that have been made for us as much as have been constructed sort of, by us. So I think it just has made me think so much, and thank you ever so much for your very, very thoughtful contributions. Now, if that's okay, I will start by asking you some questions which have come in, and they're coming in thick and fast now. So the first one is really a comment by Inderjeet Roy to Jenna, who is asking if you could say a little bit more about the absent subject of dependency theory. Didn't dependency theorists highlight how the global South was silenced rather than as silent? So that is something that I think also, let me just see if there's anything specific that connects to that. And again, yeah, so I'll start with Jenna, but I think then going on from there, there's a question for Olivia about moral clarity by someone whose name isn't there, but I would say there is no moral clarity. Individuals and organizations may not want to be accused of racism, but they are quite happy if actions and policies are in fact racist, as long as they do not stand accused of racism. The targeted measures and perceived improvements over time are used as indicators to mystify clarity. So that's for you, Olivia, I think. And then a broader question that has come up a couple of times, which is, I'll let you start on that one, Siba, is can development be rethought within the Enlightenment paradigm? And if not, as we are all educated within that paradigm, how do we suggest we move out of it? Now, that is the big question, right? And I think that goes to also Meera, because in practice, and then I've got some really interesting practical question we've got at Warwick in Africa program. So how would you approach a program like that, which sort of, is based on students going to Africa and, bringing colleagues from Africa to Warwick to sort of learn from each other and co-produce knowledge and all that. But how do you approach development in a non-racist way? So I'll stop there for a minute, and I'll then maybe if we can have a second round, that'll be fine. Jenna.
Thank you, Shireen. To the question, thank you so much for that question. So the idea of the dependency theory and the absence African, for much of this idea of pathologized Blackness, it's centered on this question of the potentiality of betterment, right? How can the African improve his lot? For the modernist theorists, it's focused on the internal impediments to betterment, right? You have market failure, you have certain, the lack of domestic institutions, questions of like, how do we get a temporary role of the state in building up the necessary institutions for modernization? But for dependency theorists, it's less a question about the internal dynamics, but rather the global structural impediments on developing economies. At least what I argue, and drawing on the work of like Hobson and others, is that for much of dependency theorists, the idea of capitalist modernity in the way in which it has its productivity gains is an eminent critique. It is as though the European economic success has been unproblematically internalized, so as to leave out the relationships and that from to leave out the non-Western that excludes the role that the non-West was used to help generate European success. So that's what I mean by absent, right? That the role of the plantation, the role of the silver mines, right? These are all excluded. These are all absent from the narratives of this European industrial success. And the argument goes is that dependency theorists have tended to see betterment in that sense, right? I hope that's given a bit of clarity. Thank you for the question though. And sorry.
No, not at all. It's lovely to hear sort of gurgle of new life, which is the baby is so young. Olivia, also I've got a question which I think you can wrap up with the one I already gave you, which is from John Hobson, which says, how do we develop a non-racist theory approach to development studies? So it's not just practice, it's also the discipline. So go for it, girl.
Yeah, I saw all these questions and he's assuming that I won't agree with the question. Actually, to explain why I had this book ready, I'd love to say that I'm in a telepathic relation with Meera, and in a way probably we are. But the thing that I forgot to do, but I was going to read out, was actually the last part of his definition about development, which is the economic one. And I think it will be quite useful. And so he asked, what is economic development? A society develops economically as its members increase jointly the capacity for dealing with the environment. And that's why I wanted to read it, because you brought up the ecological. This capacity for dealing with the environment is dependent on the extent to which they understand the laws of nature. He calls that science. On the extent to which they put that understanding into practice by devising tools, calls that technology, and on the manner in which work is organized. So just to reiterate, there is a mix of so many different ideas that, it's not even the point of saying, is it more or less Marxist, is it more or less that? But I do think that there is a power in these compound definitions for us to take them into the present, not necessarily to say that's exactly what he meant or not, but when we have discussions about anti-racism, but especially also climate change and ideas about decoloniality and coloniality, it is flexible and broad enough for us to think through some of these examples. And I would say that that's some of the qualitative differences between what this development aid machine is doing and then what we can expansively think through what development could be. And the Enlightenment question I leave for Siba, but I know it's kind of like it's in there somewhere, right? I wanted to briefly say something about solidarities because I've been struggling really, like, do I even want to use that word, especially if I want to formulate something to do with how to disentangle the racism of what we have now with something that we could do. The reason why I pause and call it or invoke the concept of solidarity is very concretely from my classroom. And it's not just the classroom, but it's also, I think, what motivates many people to be in the development sector or any of that. And it's also my own fight against cynicism. But it's this idea that at our level of critique, we can really like dismantle the whole thing, right? But what is left, and I think what is also valuable, is that a lot of what pushes people even into this conversation is that we are not detached from the human desire or capacity to have a particular relationship that could be one of solidarity, right? But I want to caveat that immediately by bringing it back to from what positionality are we having this conversation? And there are some of us on this planet, and I don't exclude myself from that historically maybe don't have the luxury to keep on calling this solidarity, but the moment that they decide to be in solidarity from a global northern perspective, it translates into something that we need to attend to repair. Right? And so those two are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but the danger with just dabbling in solidarity is that we reproduce this place of innocence from which then we're going to do stuff for other people, the Lords but as an entry point, I don't think that solidarity is that toxic. It's like we can do with it what we want, right? But that's how I would connect, I guess, the general desires that can be benign, you know, the benignness that also Siba, the stuff that is salvageable. I just think that from a Northern perspective, there's very little of that can last over time if we're not willing to politicize it. And for me, repair is a way to politicize what needs to be done in a particular moment in history. And that is also where I put the thing about moral clarity. I'm not saying that the development world, NGO world, or whatever creates moral clarity, on the contrary. But I think a discussion about racism forces us to engage very clearly with a moral position about who gets to live and who gets to die. And I know that we often forget that that's actually what the conversation of racism is about, right? But even in historical terms, the reason why everybody gets so nervous when racism comes up is that we've all been taught in school that whatever Hitler did, and you know, that is the moral compass, right? So maybe not moral clarity, but there is a moral compass that is contained in that. But I'm not saying necessarily that moral compass translates into people behaving ethically or morally, just so that they won't be called racist. But that's also why there's so much energy put into making sure nobody calls you racist. Whether your practices are racist, that's usually slightly less important. So in a way, I do agree with the comment, but it's just to clarify what I meant. The Warwick program, Warwick in Africa program, and I think also it's a really, really good question there also, because, you know, teaching or trying to teach development anti-colonially in a classroom with students sent away on, I think we're limited in the infrastructure in which we're trying to engage this. I think it's just, it's almost impossible to not reproduce certain racist logics within those programs. Whether the question is then, let's stop them immediately, I think, it wouldn't be that bad, but it's so extremely important to, while we offer them still, and it's also a point of attraction, I think, for a lot of our degrees. So we have an institutional question that we're looking at, but I often in class try to reverse the thing and explain to students the extent to which we would be comfortable to have people that don't even speak English come into the most challenging parts of our society to come and fix something, right? And it's not just like flagging up the critique, but somehow, if then they go to at least create this understanding of how deeply problematic it is, and not just like, if I do cultural sensitivity training, then I will, you know, then I will go as a good person there. There is something, again, to think about in terms of abolition, but it's also super structural to the extent that even if we wanted to make it reciprocal, just the Home Office does not distribute visas in the same way that then it happily sends our kids out to the Global South, right? So I would say, I would actually encourage for us to think through this racist question, the question about racism, through these very concrete practices of what we put in the syllabus, but also what are the programs that we I think for now, I will stop here, but to take the other questions in the next round, I hope we will have them, but John, I'm not dodging, not dodging you, but I think I want to think of that a bit more. Thank you.
Siba. And actually sorry.
Thank you. What I'm going to say has nothing to do with the fact that I consider you all my children, but I want to talk about how my son forced me to explain something to him, right? He asked me, why do we have race? Why do people talk about race? And I said, if you think of the British monarchy, the German when they had it and everybody else, they gave us this idea of, you know, you have your siblings, then you have the half siblings, and you have the step siblings, and you have the foster siblings, and etc. And it all had to do with this inheritance, right? As Megan and what his name are now finding out. And I think that race is basically what it did to humanity. We decided what proximity we have to our own inheritance. But that inheritance was not produced by just the siblings. In fact, they were the lazy ones in the castle. It's the people outside who produced it, right? And so when I think about development studies, and somebody tells me, how do we do anti-racial development? We actually have to start, first of all, knowing what problem we are trying to solve. Those problems have been stipulated from as long as the history of development have happened. As I was talking from Lord Lugar to League of Nations, United Nations, and etc. The problem is that we actually don't listen to those people. And if we do, if in fact we had in archive, those people were part of our conversation, there are a few things we know. A, we know that the idea that some people have technology and science and other people don't is bunk. The Bushmen who are today left to roam the desert in Namibia actually gave the Germans the technology to extract mining technology before they were dispossessed of the land and sent to the bushes to be left wandering. That's one of the cruelest episodes of human history. And when we look at them, we think that they were born that way and like living in the desert in the way they do. So development as it is conceived now academically is either, for me, sometimes I think of it as a bad joke or humoring me. Because nothing that those people who claim technology, science, etc., did not generate it on their own. They did not possess it on their own, right? So in the context of France, after World War II, the whole idea of development, if you look at people who are in the French Assembly, what they were saying was, how can you even begin to say that you are developing, we are not, you are going to help us? You couldn't even have the concept of national accounting in the French language because the French had no economy. Who could define the economy of Great Britain until 1947 without India, right? So the problem is not really that somebody is going to help you because you are helpless, and you always knew what to do. We all know what to do. It is actually to cut through the fog and just talk about access and relationships and etc. in the way that Meera was beginning to talk about it. That is actually what development studies should focus on, because it's predicated on a big lie, and we just have to. You can take it. You can be anti-capitalist, all of this. It simply is that all that exists was made by all, and we just have to see how we approach how it has been distributed and the practices that cause that distribution, and to put them into question. But there's no, so that for me actually is Trio's trope about what is said to have happened and what actually happened. What actually happens is that the world is what it is because you all made it what to happen. The slave and whoever was there who was the lazy one who calls himself master, and that's right. And I think that those actually are serious. We actually seriously have to consider. It's not just a question of distribution, because that also means that you are counting on you are counting on empathy. It's not that. It's not solidarity really. Even though we can have solidarity moment in any project, which is indispensable, that's how humans function. But it is really a fundamental question of distribution and redistribution, not distribution as handout, right? But recognizing that the tools that the people think that they have, which don't belong to them, that if they were given to other people over there, that new life form, new conception of life will not have created. They are actually a democratic moment to be had, right? If in fact these technologies were widespread, and if we actually derive from their uses certain conception of life, of how we are and where we go, and etc. I'm just going to stop there because I could go on this forever. But really, we have to stop humoring ourselves with the idea that development is people have it and they are going to help us. They didn't have it before. It's not theirs in the first place. It's not their technology. It's not their knowledge. Most of that was gleaned from other people. And one of the problems of development is that today is actually the fundamental authoritarianism that some people know and will help. And we should be happy about it. I stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Siba. Meera, I think I'm going to recast the questions for you because there are several. So one is from Eloise Weber, who we all know and love. There are different political ideologies of development. Which do you think is most compelling and why? Might be the question to ask because we've already talked about Rodney, we've already talked about dependency, we've already talked about modernization, post-development, all that. So what is the most compelling and why? And an attached question, I suppose, is from Peter Wanwasi, who says, can we reconceptualize development as a human rights issue, as a structural remedial form of thinking? So that could be another way of thinking about it. And I think then there are several questions, one question in particular, actually, which I want you to see if you want to respond to, which is UK specific, which is how do we respond in an anti-racist, anti-colonial way to UK government's recent cuts to its aid budget, okay? And finally, what about aid from other countries which are non-Western, such as China and India in Africa? Okay, so aren't they also following the colonial logic, or is it different from Western development aid and epistemology? That is from Anahita Aryan. So I think that's kind of a bundle of questions about aid and development and positionality of our thinking, right? So go for it.
Okay, I will try. So Heloise's question on, sorry, can you still hear me? Yes, okay, good. Sorry, I touched something on this headset and I don't know what it was. Which is the most compelling theory of development and why? So, I mean, I suppose just to slightly recap and maybe slightly cop out, I think the externalist models of development which emphasize the global integration of the economy are clearly more robust and more valuable than those which attribute national wealth to internal national dynamics. I think that there is so much evidence there in every corner that you look. And Gominda Bambra's work recently has done a really amazing job at like tracing lineages such as the ways in which the wealth of empire directly produced the welfare state in Britain, right? So this idea of migrants getting handouts is like a totally upended. I still do think that the language of development, though, is so constraining in that respect. So I do prefer these alternatives, this idea of repair, or the idea of inheritance, you know, our common inheritance, in Heloise's herself suggested universal entitlements. That goes to Peter's question, which is, can we reconceptualize development as a question of human rights and a sort of structural remedy? I think, yes, potentially, particularly the remedial aspect, again, is good in part because it pushes towards, and I think this touched on one of the other questions, it gives a sort of diagnostic element there. So if we just talk about inequality or we just talk about the wealth gap, we defer the question of who is responsible and why is there a wealth gap and so on. Whereas if we talk in the language of repair and remedy, as Olivia has already said, then we have a more substantive set of claims there. Hannah's question, I think, is incredibly interesting. And there is, in some respects, if you like, a convergence between an ultra-conservative view, well, maybe not even an ultra-conservative, a conservative view that one should retreat from the global south, and you know, things that Olivia's written about, which is this idea of ethical retreat. And I was reading my former colleague Tom Young's book on the Western Africa, and he's arguing for a retreat, but from a more conservative standpoint than I think than Olivia's is. I actually think the tactical priority in terms of the UK government's recent cuts to its aid budget is to focus on the other stuff that I was talking about. So actually looking at intellectual property rights and global infrastructure and trade law and all of these other things that I think are materially more consequential in some respects at an aggregate level. That doesn't deny the hugely awful effects that the in-program cuts have had around the world to people involved in that. But in a way, I think pushing on those other doors rather than seeking to restore the aid budget and to restore the place of aid could be a more useful alternative. And finally, on the question of China and India, are they also following a colonial logic? I mean, I think on one level, one has to say straightforwardly, yes, where it involves mass land dispossession and the imposition of particular models of development and or the silencing of workers' rights and human rights and the instrumentalization of labor and the generative disposability of all of these activities, then yes, this is a colonial logic. And I used to have more of a problem with saying that, I suppose, than I do now. And this is why, I mean, in the book and elsewhere, I've tried to think about racism as a race and gender and class actually as logics of disposability. And I keep banging on about this because when you understand it as disposability, then there isn't a problem in saying, well, actually the state is treating you as disposable. And that is very similar to the ways in which, you know, the West treated the indigenous peoples of the Americas as disposable or, you know, non-persons, right? And then we see the connectivity of power and the promiscuity of strategies of empire and colonialism in all of the forms of modern administration that you have now. So I suppose it helps us draw together those threads.
Thanks. I've got a really interesting comment here from Rahel Sabhatu. Very interesting discussion, which is closely related to my own PhD. She says, any chance the panelists are going to do a book project together? And if yes, what do I have to do to be part of it? So watch this space, Rahel. I think those were the main questions. And unless I've got any others, which I have missed and are urgent and people would like to raise, I think we are kind of done. So for me, you know, at the end of this, it seems to me that we are all in some ways, I mean, this is like part of an ongoing conversation. This is not the end point of a conversation. You never were invited to, and you would never have accepted the invitation to end a conversation. We don't do end of history here. We do, you know, engaging with history, as Siba has very nicely done, and as has Jenna, and sort of, you know, all of you in different ways. So for me, I think the question is, where do we go from here? And what different connectivities do we need to kind of reveal, but also to make in order to shift, which has been the major concern. Like, what do we do? Where do we go from here now? Critique is fine, but as you were saying, Olivia, you know, it's also a luxury. Unless you have a kind of a politics of solidarity, which is also the politics, not just of repair, but as you said, reparation. And I think was it Tucker and Yang's piece on also sort of, you know, unless it is redistributive, this critique, then we do get involved in all that sort of danger that you pointed out about sort of, you know, co-option. So really it is about ongoing struggles. But I suppose by posing this question, what we were trying to do was to say, hey, there is a problem that we all need to engage with. And it is not just enough to sort of, you know, critique it from, you know, different critiques from different points of view. And as Eloise was saying, but also historically different. So this is a moment when we can actually look back and see what has been, how it has been critiqued development till now, and what do we bring to the table. So I just found it very thought-provoking, and I just feel we are in solidarity on that, at least, I hope you will say. So as I said, if there's any one final comment or question, would one of the panelists like to say something? Olivia.
Yeah, because I did not dodge, but I postponed John's question, and I think it kind of ties in with your final comments here, Shireen, but the invitation of where do we go from here, right? So I don't think I would, in principle, object to the question. And his question is, I hear Olivia's objection to what I'm about to say, but how do we develop a non-racist theory/approach to development studies? And I think my objection, or the way that I would reformulate this question, is that the first concern should not necessarily be a theory or an approach to development studies. Like there is no, I think, especially after everything that Siba said, there is very little ground to say that we need to salvage that by definition, right? So that would be the first thing. But then the elements of development desires, let's say, that are not mastered, but maybe they are about solidarity, living together better, or having something to do with repair. There is a huge, vast field of all our different disciplines in the humanities and outside of it that we can carry that spirit in there. So I would say not necessarily a desire to salvage that, and we need an approach just for development studies, but what do we smuggle out of there? And I would say in abolitionist thought, it might actually be much more salient to, like Siba said, stop kidding ourselves and do something else. But that is generative. And listening to everything, I was thinking, if in the middle term we're going to think about, or we still have to work through development as it exists, already recalibrating it as a study of how we could end the dispossession, the different dispossessions. That, then again, like, call it development studies if you want, that's not even the point. But again, it would be such a radically different intellectual, but also practical engagement that does not allow us to keep on reproducing the lie, because yeah, I do agree. It's a really big fat lie. And it's just really difficult to say that in an intellectual way without wasting a lot of time. But I think that's what it comes down to. So I hope I answered that question a little bit.
Great.
Shirin, sorry, can we pick up on Pamela's question?
Yeah, I was just going to do exactly that. I was thinking, like, I sort of missed. And so this is from Pamela. Thank you very much for all your ideas. I have a pragmatic question that has dogged me when I try to bring this up, this criticism in my own context. I'm a Southeast Asian scholar in philosophy, working at the crossroads of philosophy and development. Many people ask me how then is this going to help us attend to the immediate pressing needs of marginalized people, especially in my home country, the Philippines. There seems to be a kind of impatience with ground up democratic processes and mass movements, which then in turn tacitly endorses populist authoritarian governments, not just in Philippines, sadly, undermining the democratic processes and replicating colonial relationships because these leaders position themselves as getting things done. So any thoughts and comments on that? I think that's a really important and thoughtful question, but it also connects with that other question about what about India and China and Africa? What about populist leaders in post-colonial states, right? So comments, anybody who wants to pick up on this?
Can I start in a way that doesn't necessarily answer the question? No, but there's something really important that this question drives at, which is, if you like, the desire for spectacle and results in mass politics, right? And the need to create something spectacular as a means of getting politics done. And when I was listening to Pamela's question, I was thinking about anti-racism work and the ways in which the politics of spectacle is now changing anti-racist work to be something which is spectacular and performative and authoritarian and top down, because we are getting something done now and we are really changing, rather than the intimacy of conversations, democratic processes and so on, which are messy, which don't produce obvious kind of changes. I mean, we're having a discussion internally at SOAS at the moment about, you know, KPIs for anti-racism. And so it's this thing about, like, what is spectacular and what can be measured and what can deliver on people's frustrations. And so Brexit is a great example of something spectacular that will do nothing to alleviate the frustrations of the many people who are frustrated about different things, because the solution was not connected to the frustrations in the first place. So unfortunately, I think the answer, which is not a very optimistic one, is that doing grassroots work that has resonant political meaning and having a lot of people who are doing that work is one of the only antidotes to this kind of populist authoritarianism, which we can find in countries as well as movements and institutions and all the rest of it.
Thank you.
If I may just add something, if Meera is done. I saw you were muted, so I assume you were done. I just wanted to say the reason that when I was starting, I talked about colonial and colonizing, actually was to hint at different processes we all recognize colonialism is racism and etc., etc. And that's, you know, verse and chapter and verses and etc. And what I think we should pay attention to, which is what I was hinting at, in the concept, of course, of development project post-colonialism in the post-colonies, was really that there are, you know, India, Sri Lanka, everywhere, that the critique of development and colonialism did not necessarily translate in the ability to transcend that which one critiqued, right? And also in those societies, my own, there were always processes there that resembled, that were authoritarian, right? That were hierarchical. Some of them in the footage in Guinea, really very feudal in their origins and etc. And which we have to admit always existed there. Which is why, actually, when I talk about development, I actually want to talk about that. It's not just a function of race, it's actually it's a certain ways of approaching life, generally, of which development is a dimension. And we have to pay attention to what it does. We critique it for its violence, for its authoritarianism, for its exclusion, for the destruction of nature, and etc., etc. That is not simply the property of white people. And I want to be crude here. And we have to acknowledge that. And so, yes, I want to talk about colonialism, but I want to talk about that which is colonized, which are, you don't have to read Bourdieu, habitus and all that, but habit we picked along the way, but also habit we had before white people showed up. Again, I'm being crude here. And I think that we actually have to be very honest about those, which is why, right, the India question is, now speaking as an African, the India question is very interesting. I was once, just 1 minute, I was once with somebody, BJP guy who came to Guinea, had a lot of money, was trying to trash Indira Gandhi. And I just had to stop him and just say, do you know, by the way, why after the civil war in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, the president there didn't ask for only Indian police force and that there should be all women? And I had to lecture him briefly about the history of developmentalism in the Gandhi family. They may bankrupt today some of their ideas. I don't know what Indians are doing with them, but there was something there that actually is redeemable. And you can't just come here and try. The reason Africans are so open to India today had to do with that woman you are trashing. In fact, in a paradoxical sort of way, developmentalism of the Nehru family version is what endeared India to Africa, which is why Africans hope that India at least will be different from, say, the French and the British. So, right, there's a lot of things there to unpack. And I don't just want to say that development now, our tragedy is really its formulation in the West. It really is something to attend to as a sort of global phenomenon and beyond race. And I have to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. Jenna, do you have any final comments?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback a bit on something Siba had said earlier about traditions. And I was thinking, to me, this is more like me thinking out loud than having like a definitive response. But the question like that David Scott poses is one of tragic inheritance. And how is it possible to move forward? Or put differently, I don't think it's possible to move forward within this Enlightenment thinking. But how we have structured our socio and economic and political institutions are imbued with this inheritance, a tragic inheritance of a colonial imposition. And for me, I think what is reparative to what Meera was saying was this question of thinking outside of that Enlightenment thought and looking, as how Shilliam talks, excavating other ways of thinking and including them into repairing, but constructing anew. So there you think of like Du Bois, right? And that type of work. And how that then broadens our conceptualization of citizenship. Because the citizenship that we have today is one that pretty much excludes rather than, you know, build upon anything new. So I think I will end on that note.
Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of our time together, though I could sit here and chat with you for a very long time. And thank you to our participants, our attendees, for wonderful questions. It's such a shame that sort of these are the problems of technology, that sort of, we can't see you in this format, and we can't feel you in this, if we were meeting face to face, we would have been in the same room, and yet you have engaged so wonderfully with the speakers. So look forward to talking to these guys about them writing a book together. But until then, goodbye, and do look out for our future events. Thank you again to the panelists. Bye-bye.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you. So happy to see you all, and see you again sometime soon.
Yeah, thank you, Siba. Thank you.